What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Marvel's Midnight Suns, the superhero tactical RPG from Firaxis, the makers of XCOM. But before we dive into that too much, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything that I cover, and you're not subscribed, go to my channel and the first video you'll see is a video explaining everything that I go over. Moreover, my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below, and with that out of the way, let's actually dive into this thing. So as I mentioned, Marvel's Midnight Suns is a tactical RPG set in the Marvel universe. If you're unaware, tactical RPGs are generally turn-based games focusing on, you guessed it, tactics, often utilizing a mission structure, which is in fact the case here as well. But Midnight Suns has the interesting addition of a sort of dating simulator minus the dating attached to it as well, with various well-known superheroes like Captain America, Iron Man, etc. And I suppose you could say it's more of a friendship simulator, but we'll get to that, I suppose. Because the first thing I want to talk about here is difficulty and New Game Plus. Now, with tactical RPGs, generally speaking, there's not a ton of replay value, so much as the game's just giving you reasons to continue playing through the combat missions, which is why, like a lot of TRPGs, the emphasis really isn't on the difficulty you start with, but rather makes it adjustable throughout the game. And in the case of Midnight Suns, there are several higher difficulties, but you have to start on normal at most. Once you start completing missions and earn a certain number of rankings, you can get a 1 to 3 star rating depending on how you do in each battle, and once you get enough stars on each difficulty, you'll unlock the next higher difficulty, which for the most part just increases health and damage of enemies, as well as the currency rewards you get for completing the missions. This is in part where New Game Plus comes into play, because once you beat the story, you can New Game Plus if you want to. The thing is, there's not really much of a point to New Game Plus in my opinion, as there isn't really anything in New Game Plus you can't get through a regular playthrough. There's a ton of cosmetics, which we'll talk about, but you can get pretty much everything in one run through of the game and then continue playing through the general missions after you've beaten the story. So there's no real reason to New Game Plus unless you just really want to, especially given the way that the difficulty is handled, which bleeds a little bit into the progression of the game, because once you reach the max level, which is 25, you can technically keep leveling via what are called champion levels. While these are not nearly as substantial as the main leveling system, you will continue to get health and damage boosts by leveling farther, which can make getting to the higher difficulties very grindy and doesn't serve much of a purpose unless you just love the game, I suppose. Now from there, let's talk a little bit about the story setup for this one. Lilith, the mother of demons, gets resurrected and is bringing about an apocalypse by trying to summon an old god to destroy the world. In response to this, the heroes of today resurrect the person who stopped her last time, which is your character, known as the Hunter, who is in fact the child of Lilith. You do get to customize this character a little bit, but it is worth mentioning that it's relatively minor stuff, mostly cosmetic. Your hero is much more customizable in terms of what you can do than all of the other heroes, but even then you are kind of locked into a style, if you will, but you do get to customize your protagonist. And naturally, from there, we team up with all sorts of superheroes to stop Lilith and the demons. However, the intro and much of the game doesn't really focus on that so much as it does the setup for the hub area, known as the Abbey, which serves as your little side area friendship simulator. And I mention this because the first 5 hours or so of this game are not good. The writing is awful, the story's very disjointed, and it's a very juvenile experience is how I would describe it. However, it does get better once you get past that. The intro to the game is just very poor in my opinion. I'm sure some people will probably like it, and after the 5 hour or so mark when the game opens up and starts letting you tackle it properly, I actually started enjoying it overall. But the beginning introduction to this game is just not well done. You really gotta muscle past that to get to the good part. But even then, I wouldn't say the writing ever gets really good or anything. It mostly just goes from really bad to okay. And now let's talk a little bit about the structure of the game and how all of this kind of fits together. So once you're past the part where they're just kind of tutorializing you and introducing you to everything, the days of the game, because there is a day counter, but it doesn't mean much, does have a structure to it. During the beginning of the day, you'll go around, do all of your activities around the hub area, primarily around upgrading your abilities, handling side activities and the like, which we'll talk a bit more about in just a second, all until you are ready to take on a mission. You'll then do the mission, of course. Then once that mission is over, it switches to nighttime at the Abbey. This is where you can hang out with other superheroes during a hangout, they call it, potentially attend a club meeting, which is more friendship stuff we'll get to, or continue exploring and doing some quests. Now, some quest stuff as well as exploration-related things, as there is a decent bit to the Abbey, can only be done at night or daytime, so there is some variance there in what's available. And the hub area itself is rather explorable. There are a ton of mysteries around the Abbey that you can solve, exploration to be undertaken. Doing so will unlock more and more areas of the Abbey, which will grant you more and more rewards, typically in the form of cosmetics. But we'll double back to that towards the end of the video in its own section. But for now, know that the hub area can be explored, mysteries undertaken, things like that, in what feels like its own little separate adventure game sometimes. That said though, I keep referring to a friendship simulator, so let's talk about that. Like most games with companions, you want to grow close to your companions, in this case, other superheroes from the Marvel Universe. This is mostly done through the traditional routes. You'll occasionally have conversation options, and while they don't really change the conversation much, they can affect your friendship level with various heroes, and while it is incredibly difficult to fail at this, outside of just deliberately trying to tank one of these relationships, I really don't think you could, but that's one of the main ways you'll see it done. And then the heroes that you take with you on missions in teams of 3 will also gain friendship points, and eventually you'll hit one of the 5 tiers. Doing so unlocks a conversation where you'll talk to the hero, usually about some event, which will cause you to learn more about them, of course, as well as providing combat rewards via the form of hero combos, which are powerful attacks that multiple heroes can perform together. For the most part, this is okay. I don't necessarily mind it. It's not terribly different from other games. I will mention though that in some places the friendship conversations actually break the game's continuity a little bit depending on when you got to certain friendship levels. For instance, I noticed a couple of the conversations have the potential to mention someone that died as if they were alive, or alternatively, mention characters that you have not gotten yet as if they are already on the team. But if that wasn't enough for you, you can choose to hang out with these heroes at the end of each day, which will be like an activity where you can have a conversation with them, which gives you a chance to net extra friendship points with that hero, helping you rise through the ranks more quickly. In addition to this though, several of the heroes will form clubs. There are 3 to be specific, and this is where it gets a little over the top. So you got this world-ending crisis going on, which is what the missions focus on, and then at nighttime you have that sort of juxtaposed against these heroes meeting up for a book club or a group called literally the Emo Kids, which I think presents a bit of a narrative dissonance towards the beginning, and then towards the later parts of the game, when these clubs start to wrap up what they have prepared for you, a lot of them wrap up by being like, oh, well, we got all this big stuff going on. I guess we won't have time to meet anymore. And it just feels very poorly thought out. But that especially, and kind of the selfish wants and needs of these people in the face of a literal apocalypse, makes the whole friendship side of the game just feel very strange against the serious backdrop they're trying to present. And while I'm sure this won't bother everyone, I didn't care for it. But from there, let's actually talk about the other progression systems. So as I've already mentioned, we'll be leveling up as we go up to a maximum of level 25. There are also champion levels past that, which continue to incrementally increase health and damage. Your heroes will also be leveling up to potentially 25, though they are forced to a minimum level as you progress through the story, so you don't necessarily have to use all of them all the time. There's the whole friendship side of progression, as I mentioned. As you increase friendship levels with various heroes and the overall friendship level, you'll unlock various benefits in combat, such as buffs and straight up attacks that you can do that are very strong. But then there's the other parts of it, and this is largely down to customizing your deck of cards, as this is card-based combat, and as we complete combat encounters, we'll be finding gamma coils, which are essentially card packs that we can unlock in our Abbey hub, which will unlock abilities for the heroes that were on that mission that gave you the gamma coil. Once you start getting a bunch of duplicates for various cards, you can then upgrade your cards by combining them into a better version of the one you had. Once you get to a certain point in the story, you can also start to add modifiers to individual cards from a pool, which can further kind of change up what the cards themselves actually do. And at a certain point, you will be able to just craft very specific cards that you want as well, provided you've obtained them before. So while there is an element of randomness to finding and using certain abilities, once you get to a certain point in the game, you can very much so craft exactly what you're looking for, which all has its various currencies and things associated with each system that we'll talk about a bit later as well when we talk about the cosmetics. Various features around the Abbey can also be upgraded as well by getting research. As you take on missions, one of the potential rewards are artifacts. Studying them increases your research level, which allows you to research upgrades to the Abbey, which will let you do various helpful things like send idle heroes on missions that will upgrade their abilities, net you more resources, that kind of thing. More or less all of what you would expect from a TRPG. But now let's talk about probably the best thing the game has going for it, and that's the combat itself. I'll be the first person to tell you I don't care much for card-based mechanics, and yet despite being someone who doesn't like that kind of thing, even I have to admit the combat in this game is remarkably good. You're going to typically be taking 3 characters into a mission. Sometimes for story reasons you might have more, but generally you've got 3 heroes, which won't always include your main character. Sometimes for the general missions you don't have to take your character with you, but rather you can take any of the 3 heroes. Each hero will have an 8-card deck, which has a few restrictions. For instance, you can only have 4 attack cards, you have to have heroism cards, which we'll talk about. So it's not a complete free-for-all in what you're allowed to have, so that's your first kind of guiding line. Each turn, you will also be able to redraw various cards. If you don't draw cards that you actually want to use, you can redraw several. There are also items that you can use in combat for free, which can do anything from providing more redraws or taunting enemies, healing you, providing you heroism, etc. Heroism is a sort of battle resource. As you use most of your basic attacks, they will generate heroism. This will enable you to use your heroic cards, which are typically your big damage dealers. However, there are also various environmental things scattered around each individual level that heroism can also be spent on to attack enemies via the environment. And all of these systems together combine to make a system that is more fun than you would think. Despite it being card mechanics and, having to draw, you still feel very much so in control of the flow of the fight if you're utilizing the environmental stuff, your heroism properly, tactically using your abilities in a way that's going to get rid of the most amount of enemies. When it comes to enemies, you have enemies that will die to one hit no matter what, and then enemies you'll actually have to deal some damage to. You can also potentially drop enemies off of ledges, which is a % chance based on the amount of health they have left. Some enemies will have armor that needs to be chewed through. There are also objectives around the combat, which helps vary it up a little bit, though I will say my main negative for the combat, and really the only one that I've got, is that the enemy variety is very lacking. The vast majority of the game you're just going to be fighting generic Hydra goons until a little bit later in the game when they start adding some demons to the mix, but even the demons are usually like just one static pool of demons. But it does get better a little later in the game, like basically everything about this game. But for the first act, which took me about 20 to 25 hours on its own, I was fighting almost exclusively generic Hydra goons, so the enemy variety, especially early game, could use a bit of a shakeup. And it's of course worth mentioning that the RNG can still kind of get you. Ultimately, you're kind of using cards and using redraws, and while they've given you plenty of options, you will occasionally just get hit with bad RNG due to, what cards you're drawing when, that kind of thing. It's rare, but it does still happen. Now, from here, let's talk about microtransactions and cosmetics. First things first, this game has microtransactions, which in a single-player game, I'm not a fan of. Moreover, it's a single-player game with no sort of ongoing content component, which for me is very annoying. I don't mind cosmetic microtransactions in games that have an ongoing service component, because doing things like renting servers and creating that content costs money. Marvel's Midnight Suns is not one of those games, so the fact that they have these microtransactions is inherently frustrating. That said though, they are implemented in such an incredibly minor way, it again forces me to ask myself why they are here to begin with. Because the game has a ton of cosmetics, and with it also having microtransactions, you would think that they probably let you buy up all the cosmetics or something with these microtransactions, but that's not true. 99% of the cosmetics are earned by playing the game. There's basically 2 skins per hero that you have to buy from the microtransactions. Or if you bought like the deluxe version or whatever, it comes with all those skins, which is most of what the higher tiers of the game, if you want to put it that way, include, is just various skins. which, combined with what we know of how publishers tend to push for these things, somewhat makes me feel like these microtransactions were forced to be in here by 2K, because there's just no reason for them. They serve almost no purpose. And while the rest of the game is structured in a way that would make you think further monetization, it just never comes. For instance, you have your actual gold, which is usually used to build upgrades to the Abbey. There's gloss, which is used to actually purchase the unlocked consumables, but you earn that just through regular gameplay. Card crafting uses 3 different currencies: attack, skill, and heroic essence. There's the paid currency, which is like midnight something or another. And all of that just screams monetization that we typically see in mobile games, but then again, none of it actually arrives, which to me is very curious. The way this game is set up kind of feels that like at some point they had intended more monetization and then just backed off of it. Because as it stands right now, the microtransactions are in there, but they are very unobtrusive. I would prefer they weren't there at all, and the way the game is set up makes me feel like they might try to add more monetization in the future, but as of right now, those microtransactions are really small and only apply to the tiniest portion of the cosmetics available in the game, which is just a strange situation, and I wanted to call it out here. But that finally brings us to our Steam Deck support. Like most TRPGs, it runs perfectly fine on the Steam Deck. It has controller support from the console releases, one would assume, but the controller support is there, it works pretty well, so you can absolutely play this game on the Steam Deck. Really, the only big note I have in this regard is that for whatever reason, Marvel's Midnight Suns does not have cloud saves enabled, so if you're playing this on PC and then go to use it on the Steam Deck, you will be playing different save files because there is no cloud saves here. And to be honest with you, most modern games have cloud save support, so I actually had to go into Steam and look it up to realize that for whatever reason, Midnight Suns does not have cloud save support enabled. So if you want to play it on the Steam Deck, it's very doable, it plays pretty well, though you won't be able to carry forth your save files if you're using them. And that brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So the big positive for me was the combat. I expected not to like it going into this, just to reveal my own biases, and they managed to change my opinion. The combat in this game is quite good, which is the main focus of a TRPG. It is a tactical combat game, and the tactical combat is on point. But unfortunately, that's pretty much where the positives end for me. Outside of the fact that you can continue to play the game after you beat it, and there's really as much game here as you want there to be, I don't really have much else positive to say. On the negative side of things, the introduction to the game, the first 5 hours, is just not good. It takes way too long to get to the point and open up. You have all these characters who are acting like literal children, and it feels like the dialogue was written by children. And then you have all of the other aspects to the game, like around the hub area with various conversations, and it just feels like the game loses its focus when you look at anything other than the combat. And while these things do improve as you play the game, later on in Acts 2 and 3, it's not so bad, but it's very off-putting when you first pick it up, which is why, in my opinion, it feels like this game is just trying to do too many things and doing a barely passable job at most of them. Which brings us to our conclusion. Ultimately, this game succeeds at the main thing it needs to do, which is have fun tactical combat. It nails that. The combat is fun. All of the side stuff, though, less so. The narrative is okay at best. The friendship simulator I personally could do without. I'm sure some people will enjoy that immensely, but it's not for me. Which all of that, taken as a whole, makes this a buy on sale for me. At the end of the day, they're charging AAA money for a game that basically just has good combat. If you see this on sale anywhere, or if you have a gift card or something like that, I would absolutely check it out. If you're a big fan of Marvel, I imagine you'd especially be interested in this as well. But for me, it's definitely a buy on sale. That said, guys, that is everything I've got for you on Marvel's Midnight Suns. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. Our growth has been exponential lately. The channel just recently got officially verified, which is of course a big moment for me. So truly, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.